Hey everybody, my name is Eli Pariser. I am the co-director of Civic Signals, and it's really great to be here with you at what is a critical time and a time of great uncertainty for the future of democracy and especially democratic life online. And that's what I want to talk about today. So we gather at the start of a new year. 2021 is beginning, 2020 is over, and I think a lot of us have this feeling that 2020 was an inflection point, but we don't know in which direction yet. And for people like me who spend a lot of time thinking about the nature of digital platforms and digital spaces, there's a lot to worry about. There's a lot to be angry about, because in some key ways, I think the tech platforms that a lot of us spend time in, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, have let some of us down and have let democracy down. And they've allowed abuse and disinformation while ignoring researchers who are really raising the red flags. And as a result, I think many societies that are trying to figure out how to bring people together are not well. And that promise of a democracy needs help. But I think there are also these reasons for great hope, because we're kind of at the end of the line with a certain way of thinking about how tech platforms work and what we can expect from them. And that opens up the possibility of something new. And so I think it's a good time to zoom out and ask ourselves, what do we want for our future digital life? What do we want for our kids' digital lives and for our democracy? And I think, going to the theme of this event, it's in these times of uncertainty, when we're freed from reacting to what's going to happen, that we can ask ourselves, well, what do we want to happen? So I want to share some thoughts on this question based on a couple years of research that I've been doing with my partner in investigating Talia Stroud. And as a start, as a way into the conversation, but not as the definitive word on how to solve these problems. So really, we've been talking to folks around the world about what flourishing digital space might look like and how could we do it better. And we may not have the perfect recipe, but I think we've got a lot of the ingredients. But I first want to talk about why focus on what good looks like when there are so many harms that need to be addressed. And I just want to say, understanding how digital spaces can be harmful is such critically important work. And there's been a wealth of recent research and activism to better understand what these harms are and what we might do about them, from, again, disinformation to identity theft to, the structural problems that come from marginalized groups getting treated differently by algorithms. But the reason that Talia and I are drawn to this question of how do we define what's good is that there are some elements of good that you never get to by eliminating the bad. Just like taking blood pressure medication never totally gets you to heart health. Or for that matter, thinking about social harms never actually gets you to building flourishing public spaces. So the project that I'm working on is trying to complement the work that people are doing on what are the harms by better understanding, what does good look like? What are the qualities that successful, flourishing public spaces tend to have? And before I share some of that, let me tell you a little bit about why I think it's really important that we think about digital platforms as spaces. What we do with systems has a lot to do with how we conceive of them, with the metaphors that we use to understand them. So when we think about a country's national debt, like household debt, research has shown we tend to make these mistakes about what's possible because country debt actually isn't like household debt. Or when we talk about a marketplace of ideas, we make a couple errors. First, that marketplaces naturally promote the best products. And second, that speech forums work like marketplaces. Or when we cast cancer as a battle, we suggest that dying of cancer is losing and a matter of will. So for the internet, one of the prevailing metaphors has been one of information flows mediated by algorithms. And when we think about information flows, we might think about sorting information and ranking it and amplifying it. And we might think about people as kind of nodes in a network or a graph sharing information with each other. And there's a lot of value in being able to construct these kinds of models. But the danger is that we start to imagine that what human beings primarily do is exchange information with each other, that they are mainly making arguments or sharing facts. And this can lead, on the one hand, to kind of an overly rationalistic conception of what humanity is, and it also leads to fallacies like the idea that facts alone are really helpful in changing people's minds. And on the other hand, it leads to ignoring all the other stuff about how humans behave and act, and especially the nuanced thing that is human relationships. So as we thought about what does healthy digital space look like, we first asked ourselves, what might be a more useful metaphor? And we started to explore this idea of spaces. Because when we imagine people in space, we immediately start to think about how human beings relate to each other as people. All of the nonverbal stuff that happens between people when we see them out in the world interacting. And there's all the nonverbal cues, there's all the group behavior, there's all the negotiation that happens without saying anything out loud. And so this leads to a second realization, which is that when we think about online social experiences as spaces, some of the design challenges become more obvious. So, for example, we might ask ourselves, why is Twitter a pretty, unpleasant and fractious space a lot of the time? Well, let's imagine what it would be like if it was a real place with real people in it. You would see a lot of people milling around, talking about what they care about without a lot of structure, without a lot of separation, and with everybody, talking over one another. And you'd realize there aren't very many unstructured places where strangers go to share their opinions in the physical world that are very great either. And so it might suggest something about what's missing from Twitter. But the exciting piece is, I think, looking at spaces this way also gives us some reasons for real hope. Because these problems of how to gather human beings in space are not new problems. In fact, they're as old as humanity, as old as the first human settlements. We've been dealing with these questions of, how do you make spaces that bring people together in ways where they listen to each other, where they respect each other. And there are whole disciplines of design, architects and urban designers and community builders that have been thinking about them for centuries and even millennia. So what we know now from social science is that these designs and these public spaces that have been built actually have an extraordinary amount of value for society because they knit us together. And there's really great research about how communities that have parks and libraries are not only more cohesive, but in a natural emergency or another kind of crisis event, they're actually much more able to coordinate to save people's lives. So these spaces actually literally connect people together. But in digital life, we don't have the analogs. And by the way, this isn't to say that all public spaces are great or perfect. And indeed, that's still a very complicated and politicized effort. But it is to say that there's a wealth of wisdom to draw on, including about the mistakes that we've made in the past. We've made some of these same mistakes that we're making in our digital life now before, and we can learn from all of this. So what are some lessons from thinking about physical public spaces in terms of digital life? Well, one that comes to mind immediately is the difference between making something user-friendly and public-friendly. So most digital platforms are built around optimization for individuals. They're trying to make each individual's experience a little more fluid, a little more frictionless. And when we think about successful public spaces, in contrast, in the real world, they're optimized for groups, for publics. And that means that in a way, they're actually sub-optimized for any one individual. There's when we think about a successful park or a successful town square, these are places that serve a lot of different purposes for different people at the same time. And it's actually this friction and the multi-use nature of the space that makes it somewhere that's so socially generative, where serendipity happens, where we see people who aren't like us. So how do we design digital spaces in a way that's more public-friendly rather than just user-friendly? The second lesson that I think we see from physical public spaces is that there is no universal solution, no universal code or algorithm that will encompass all of the many different varieties of human community and human life. And in fact, when we think about the most successful public spaces in the physical world, they're always imbued with this sense of local character. They're context specific, and they have this local governance as well. They're actually controlled by people locally who understand what that space means and what value we should get out of it. And digital platforms, in contrast, are typically built for scale and simplicity and replicability. And so they don't have that sense of both local control and local character that make physical public spaces so valuable and important to communities. So I think this suggests that in some ways, the project of making one algorithm that's going to accommodate human life in hundreds of different societies is itself a flawed project. And we need to be thinking in a different way about what kinds of institutions we want to build online. So the third thing that we saw was that there are these recurring motifs in both physical and digital spaces that make them places where people feel included, that are equitable, and where people flourish. And in physical spaces, that might look like something like a curb cut, which is that little bit of the sidewalk that's where the corner is shaved off so that people can more easily push strollers or wheelchairs or other kinds of wheeled conveyances, from the sidewalk to the road and back and forth. It's a simple design example, but it turns out to really open up the possibilities for a whole bunch of categories of people. And similarly, in digital life, we asked ourselves, what are the qualities that we want to build toward? And what are the ways that those qualities manifest for successful public spaces? So I can't get into everything that we found here. It's all on our website at newpublic.org. But in short, we did a bunch of literature reviews. We talked to hundreds of experts around the world, and we did a 20-country survey to kind of try to validate our findings. And what we found was 14 kind of common qualities, what we call signals, that map to 4 key categories. And the categories, I think, are both obvious but really important. So the first category is this idea of welcome. And it's this notion that you can't have a successful space, digital or physical, if people don't actually feel safe and secure and welcome to be there. The second core building block is this idea of connection. And it's not just connection with a group and a sense of belonging, but it's connection between groups, which is really important for equity, because when we look at things like how job opportunities propagate online, what we see is that they tend to cluster in these particular networks. And it's only when the networks get connected that you start to see people who are maybe less part of the in-group having an opportunity to see and apply for these jobs. The third category is creating a kind of common sense of understanding and finding ways to help people make meaning together. And this is obviously something that a lot of platforms aspire to do, but in our research, users tend to see a lot of room for improvement, that we might be able to collectively make meaning and come to some kind of common consensus through these public spaces. And the fourth, finally, is acting together. And this is really important because there's kind of this virtual cycle that happens when people start to act together, where the act of building something together with a group makes us trust the group that we're working with more, which makes us in turn want to participate more, which makes us build bigger and better things. And so when there are spaces that facilitate people acting together to create something, that often actually has these huge returns on the impact. So we've put together a whole framework with these 4 building blocks and with the 14 signals underneath them, again at newpublic.org. And our goal with this is to really start a conversation about how to define what does good look like in digital space, and how do we evaluate our current digital spaces according to this framework. And we think this framework will need some improvement and revision, but we think it offers a starting point for evaluating the existing platforms we have, but also as a roadmap for what we might build in the future. And, in this time of great uncertainty, our view is we need a bolder, bigger public imagination for our digital life. So we need to figure out, how do we build equitable, constructive, public-friendly digital spaces that do the same things that parks and libraries do in physical life? And we think that that's a space race for our time. It's one of these central questions. Because, as I said at the start, our social fabric in many ways is getting pulled apart. And if we don't figure out how to build it back together, how to bring people together around a common set of ideas, around a common set of relationships, we're not going to be able to tackle the other big problems that we have in front of us. And this may seem really hard, especially for me as an American. We're accustomed as a culture to looking for grand visions as kind of entrepreneurial ideas that happen in business. But I think there's also this really extraordinary history of public innovation as well, of people who came up with the idea of public parks and gardens, or the idea of post-secondary education for everyone, or the idea of libraries where anyone could walk in and borrow a book. And these were things that moved society forward and laid the groundwork for the democracies that we have today. So I think the real question we need to ask is, what do those things look like for the road ahead? What are the institutions that we need to make our future digital life worth living? And, at a time when the depth of dysfunction in our societies and in our technology can be overwhelming, I think when we zoom out, we can see that we've encountered these problems before, we've overcome problems like this before, and that if we have some faith and hope in each other and our ability to imagine a better future, that we can move through this era of uncertainty to the next great paradigm of how we live together online. Thank you so much for having me.